Acton.
Hi, George.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
So, for our New Year's resolution, we're going to actually say what episode it is.
That's right. We're going to begin at the beginning and say what we're doing. So this is episode 15, and we have titled it Care Under the Reign of Scarcity. When care is a service, we never have enough.
It's true.
Well, let's begin with our first things first. Can you think of a story or two from your own life or that of someone close to you that exemplifies this experience of a scarcity of care?
So I kind of I'll tell some stories that are kind of on that note. You'd think that, considering that care and not merely being born is how we become people, that like we'd all sort of be aware that care is essential to human life. But I mean, with smaller families, fewer and fewer of us actually grow up in situations where we are automatically by default both carers and carees.
Right.
Because I mean, initially a baby, can't really help out. Mm-hmm. But I mean, have you ever seen a 2-year-old like gather acorns? They're into it. I mean, like in subsistence living, kids were like, it's one of the reasons people had so many kids.
Right. They were useful.
They were necessary. Yeah. they were hands that did more than they took. Mm-hmm. They contributed more than they actually took to feed. Mm-hmm. At least initially. So I'll tell a few stories. So the woman who married one of my cousins grew up the oldest of 4. And so when she became a mom herself, she already knew like how to do those things, mm-hmm. right? It was just in her muscles. Like She didn't have to learn how to hold a baby, change a diaper, or any of that. Mm-hmm. Her husband, on the other hand, had never changed a diaper in his life, and it showed. So, and more of us experience carrying as the exception rather than the norm. So my dad, like 15 years ago before he passed, had this weird episode where he got this like serious infection, mm-hmm. and they had to like operate on him. They basically had to debride all the tissue that was infected. Mm-hmm. It was like one of those like flesh-eating bacteria things. Oof. It was gross. It was bad. So we had this invasive surgery, and eventually when he came home, I happened to be living there at the time because of where I was in my PhD program. And so I became like the wound nurse, like the nurse who was like, sent there. The travel nurse was like, showed me how to do it. And so I became the person who changed his dressings.
Wow.
And it's just, I think that sort of thing used to just be more normal.
Yeah.
On the other side of my family, my cousin's wife took a very active role in caring for our grandmother, my dad's mother, when she was elderly. Mm-hmm. It was a super throwback situation because they were living in the downstairs flat because my grandmother owned like this duplex in the Haight. And in fact, they still live there. Mm. So, and that flat had always been like a family flat. Like before that, my father's uncle, so my great uncle had lived there. And then before that, originally when they moved in, it was my grandmother's own parents who had lived in that flat when my father was young.
Wow.
So it was like this, and I know like so much of these care arrangements are in that first dimension, domestic arrangements. It's really about where people live.
Yes.
And if you live far away from your family, it sets a pattern that's hard to overcome even when there is willingness. Like during COVID, I spent a week here and there caring for my mother's mom who lived in New Jersey. But she had a live-in caretaker. And so, the family, when I went there, or my parents went there, we did so. We were like spelling the carer, mm-hmm. right? But it was taken for granted that the main care would be provided by a paid carer. And because we just no longer live in a world where there's some niece or grandchild who isn't expected to just move on in because like everybody works.
Yes.
It's like you can't, no one's going to like quit their job to care for their grandmother. I mean, that just doesn't seem... That's not the world we live in anymore.
It's not.
Obviously, that is a function of economic privilege. Like my grandmother had the means to afford paid care, and with the means comes like that mindset, right? She would not have considered. It just wouldn't have occurred to her to ask, a family member to like do that. Like that's just not in the. Like the whole paradigm is now not that paradigm. It's everybody grows up, goes to college, gets a job, moves away, has a family. It's just like that paradigm. And so maybe it's a partly romanticized notion. Because I mean, for people where this is that you have to do this, it's probably not very romantic.
Yeah.
But it's still weird to me. We've normalized the idea of care as a service. And I'm sure there were always arrangements where there was, economic aside to hiring help. I'm sure that always existed, but I don't think it's like it is now. I mean, now it's like it really is in the, now there is like big care.
Yes, that's right, big care.
And I will say, my grandmother had some lovely women who cared for her, especially the last one, which was like one of those sort of fluke things because we'd come to New Jersey because we knew the woman, we knew we were going to change cares, but then the woman they're supposedly found didn't show up. And so they found this person. They found this person at the last minute, and it was one of those totally random things where it was like the perfect person to be the last person.
Yeah. So
my point isn't that strangers can't do this work well. They can. It's like other callings. This is a calling too, right?
Yeah.
But the weirdness is that all this service work exists at the very bottom of the economic spectrum. Mm-hmm. We cannot make the most necessary work valuable.
Yeah.
It's the heart of darkness of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
The companion horror to what we're going to talk about a lot in this episode, which is life is so great, we won't procreate.
Right. And that's such an interesting way to say it. Like, we cannot make the most necessary work valuable, which to me raises this question, like, what does it mean to value something? Like, plenty of folks will give lip service to the value of parenting and the value of caring for the disabled and for the elderly, but we can't seem to assign it a commensurate monetary value. Like, we all know that we need it and we want it, but we always seem to want it for free. Or as close to free as we can get away with. And I think that's a meaningful signal, actually. I think it shows us the limits of using money as a marker of value. Like, at some point when it comes to relationships of care or obligation, money fails. And I'm skeptical that we'll ever be able to truly raise the salaries of people who provide care work. I kind of feel in my gut that people just want others to provide care because they care, right? Not because they get paid. And maybe I'll be proved wrong about that. We'll see. But I think some of it comes from, Illich talks about, he's probably getting it from Marx, the idea of use value versus exchange value. And there's something about care that has a ton of use value. Like, we just do it ourselves and it means so much. But as soon as you try to see it in terms of exchange value, like, how much is this worth if you could pay me for it? All of a sudden care just doesn't translate over into exchange value well. I don't think it does.
It's like an orchestra performance. You can't gain efficiencies. Like, it always is going to you can't increase productivity of care work. It doesn't work on that schedule. Right.
It's just, it has these superhuman limits to it. Yeah. It doesn't scale. So turning to my own experiences with the scarcity of care, the economically invisible care work that I've done in my life has been as a stay-at-home mom who also homeschooled my own kids for elementary and middle school. And I chose to do those things myself rather than work outside the home and put my kids in daycare. So that was something I wanted to do. And I valued doing the care myself because, as I said in our last interlude, I believe that love creates personhood, like especially in infancy and in the earliest years. And I felt the responsibility of that deeply and like the joy of that deeply. I really wanted to do it. And so I've been raising my kids for years while living states away from my parents and my in-laws. And part of the reason that my parents weren't able to provide, supportive care for our family as much as I would have liked when my kids were small was that they were, and they still are, providing care to my adult disabled brother who lives with them and who always will and who always has. And they're in their late 70s now, but they will never stop actively parenting. Like, their caregiving plate has always been full, so they have not sort of had the luxury of becoming the kind of grandparents they could have been if my brother hadn't been with them. And so that's been just a recognition for me, like to realize the grief of that. Like, that's just how it was. Like, they weren't able, because they needed to keep parenting my younger brother, they couldn't quite grandparent in a way that would have felt better to me. And they've done everything they could with the limitations that they have, with the love they have to give. At some point in the future, I expect that either I or my older brother, one of our families, will take my younger brother in, of course, and we'll find a way to make it work. It'll be what it'll be.
And you'll have adult children to help manage that.
Yes, at that point.
Right? It's just...
Exactly. The aging is staggered just right. It really is. Like, family it's just designed to take care of itself.
Well, and especially when you consider You know, if you have a large family, like my grandmother, I've talked about this before, was raised by her siblings because she was so much younger. I mean, she was an aunt when she was like basically a child.
Wow.
Because her sisters were having children when she was growing up.
Wow. Yeah.
So
and now women's years of fertility of when they're having kids just tend to be so much more like it's delayed and then it ends. Like it's just much tinier, you know, rather than over like a 20-year period or something.
And it's so different to have your first kid at 20 or than 40.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, socially.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And so I've never had extended family nearby to assist with caring for my children. My husband was always and is still a very involved father who's great at cooking and cleaning and at training kids to do their chores independently, which is great. So I've never felt like a Cinderella in my own house, like at the beck and call, Cinderella, you know, mom, like that has not happened to me, you know, in large part because my husband has been really involved, you know, but a household with 4 children and no free external support is still a tough situation. We've had friends and folks from church who've provided care for us at different times in a variety of ways, like free babysitting on occasion, hot meals for the family when a new baby was born. I don't know how many months it was I had. You know, we had meals when my twins were born, like also because that was kind of a big deal. You
that
know?
is a big
like,
deal.
We had a really long list of people from church, people I barely knew, yeah, as well as like all the usuals were there with hot meals. It was amazing. You know, and we've had people who will support us in different ways. Like if we have a death in the extended family, you know, people bring food over and people are there for us. But sort of like the daily grind, the day in, day out stuff was all just on us. And I eventually developed kind of emotional calluses over the absence of extended family care. Like I got over it. I got pretty darn competent. And I also learned how to not overparent.
Which is probably good.
Which is good. You know, but it solidified for me this promise to my own children. Like I will move mountains to get myself close enough to be an involved grandparent to support them and their families. If it's at all possible. Like if I'm lucky enough to get to be a grandparent, which is not guaranteed.
Which is sad when you have 4 kids to be like still crossing your fingers.
Exactly. I mean, it's not for lack of trying or anything about them. It's just the world we live in makes it really hard to partner and to have kids in time.
You have to overcome some sort of psychological barriers, definitely. And maybe some economic barriers that weren't there before.
So if I get to be a grandparent, Lord willing, I will place that role over any other options for retirement. Like, in a sense, I won't retire. Like, I will do care work until I'm so old that I need care. Right? So, and I've seen other family members of mine struggle and try to cope with the difficulty of elder care. You know, one of my family members is an only child, and between her own sizable health issues and the amount of daily care that her elderly widowed mother requires, it's hard for her to find enough time and energy to work and support herself. Like, she works herself to the bone and really ought to have care herself because of her health issues, but it's only flowing one way. You know, and if this family member and I lived in the same town, I'd be able to help both her and help her mother. You know, now that my kids are older, like I could take, me and one of my teens will go over there and we'll like do stuff. Like we could really help, you know, and drive in places. And I have extra capacity to help out now, but we live hours apart. And so again, this care problem would be so much more solvable, you know, if we all lived within 30 minutes of each other.
Which was totally, you know, the norm until like half a minute ago, sociologically. Yeah.
Yeah, so the whole care dilemma question for me centers around the forces that pull families out of reach of one another. How can we actively swim against the current of like the default cultural setting for college-educated families that makes mobility, otherwise known as rootlessness and job chasing, you know, the price of success? Like, how is it that we can only have economic stability and economic success at the cost of family stability and proximate mutual aid? Like you said earlier about the heart of darkness of capitalism, like its imperatives drive families apart, and then it offers a paid substitute for the care that we'd rather give each other for free in person if only we could be there in person.
Yeah.
So like industrial capitalism creates care scarcity by dismantling families' proximate connectedness, like in the case of my family, or by diminishing our sense of obligation to each other. I mean, there are some people who live near their families, but they don't want to step in and provide care.
Which is a different story.
It's a different problem. Yeah. And that all just makes me really angry and confused, right? That the underbelly of freedom and opportunity is the loosening of the ties that bind.
It totally is.
Yeah. It's the same phenomenon. And I know that Ivan Illich would say that the answer lies in finding the proper limits, like in finding the threshold at which we can have some more choices than we had in the past when it comes to work and career and personal fulfillment, but without going over that threshold into a place where there is just no more gravity to kind of pull us and keep us together. Like it shouldn't have to be an either or. I appreciate his language of a threshold. Like you get good things with a new system or a change up to a point. And then if you go past that, things become counterproductive. They become self-destructive. It's like, how do you feel that out, where that threshold is?
We read a whole book about this.
We did.
This is hot off the presses. It's called The Care Dilemma, Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality by David Goodhart, who is a British writer. And he starts with a very direct statement of the problem, which I actually found quite refreshing. I mean, it's in the title, right? The Age of Sex Equality, which is, of course, another term for the reign of scarcity, right?
Yep.
Okay, so he says, our challenge is this. How, in an era of sex equality, can women and men coordinate their priorities and interests to invest sufficiently in private and public care? So the directness is, of course, in regard to the acknowledgement that the people who cared for the young and the old was never in question until it became possible, and then in many cases necessary, for women to work in the wage economy. While it is now a subject of renewed debate whether this development is in the interest of most women, it is of no doubt that the quote-unquote freedom to hold the same jobs as men, well, asterisk, some jobs, right, was at the core of first and second wave feminism. Economic freedom was freedom. And certainly it is difficult to disagree that women should be doctors and lawyers and lawmakers just like men, although nobody is on the front lines wanting them to be like garbage workers and construction workers. And, you know. So, of course, that's not the whole picture. This elite jobs for women is not the whole picture. The whole picture is one of many women torn between the wish to have and raise children and have a career. The whole picture is one where an unprecedented number of children are growing up without the active participation of their biological fathers. The whole picture is a generation of children who are uniquely challenged by mental fragility, anxiety, depression, and a lack of in-person socialization, which in some broad ways can be linked to attachment styles, availability of parents in general because of work pressures or daycare, the whole kit and caboodle. So the kids, the fewer and fewer folks manage to have, at least in the weird world, right, are not okay.
That's right.
But of course, this thing we call sex equality, not a great phrase, but we'll get to that later. It's not going away. So what are we going to do about it? The problem exists at every scale, from the worldwide fertility collapse to governments to workplaces and societies and local communities to families and finally to individual women. Yeah. And so we're going to talk about all these aspects of the care dilemma, a modern problem if there ever was one.
Yeah.
So he doesn't get to this later in the book, but he does touch on it, which I thought was good because you don't really hear a lot about the global fertility collapse in the mainstream media. I feel like it's one of those issues that's kind of just ignored.
I've seen South Korea pop up every now and then because it's the worst.
Right.
The New York Times will talk about South Korea, but not.
But they'll talk about it as
it's like Italy's almost as bad. I mean, in Europe, it's not.
Or they'll talk about it from that lens of like, well, men are assholes, so women don't want to procreate with them. Because we talked about this in the very first episode.
Yep.
Okay, so is it bad if the world runs out of people?
I can't believe we're asking that question.
That's the first question. I mean, I think less is fine, but I think we can agree that I think the data is there to suggest that getting there will not be pretty. So it may be a surprise to a certain number of people to learn that birth rates all over the world are actually falling. Not just the weird Western world, but everywhere. Almost everywhere. I think there's I'll link to a talk about this given recently. Almost everywhere, they are now under replacement fertility, defined kind of awkwardly as 2.1 births per woman because you have to account for the mortality, the small amount of child mortality that takes place before that next generation can have their own children. Mm-hmm. So you need just over 2. So the question is no longer whether the global population will shrink, but what effects the shrinking will have. And of course, will it be seriously long term? So in that longer term, it is entirely possible that a lower human population could remain stable. Like we could drop and then just, and I think there's it's entirely possible that could have benefits in terms of, lowering environmental impact. Mm-hmm. But in the short term, it's going to cause a lot of social and economic upheaval. And in particular dire cases like South Korea, which is always getting the mention, it may mean the entire disappearance of an existing nation and its culture. And this has almost become a meme in this space, right? Mm-hmm. Goodhart says, in 2100, Koreans will be remembered as a quasi-mythical people who emerged from a period of violent division, made TVs 96,000% cheaper, and then inexplicably vanished. It's a little glib, right?
Yeah.
It reflects this attitude that these population scientist people really do seem to consider the demise of South Korea a fait accompli. Mm-hmm. But we should probably resist that confidence because do you remember 1968's book, The Population Bomb?
Yeah.
It predicted starvation and shortages as population outstripped agricultural capacity. But instead we had the Green Revolution.
Right.
And none of the things forecast in that book came true. And as my husband is fond of saying, it's easy to predict the future. It's just not easy to be right. So that said, in today's case, while we cannot be sure that birth rates will not rebound, meaning South Korea could end up a much less populous but still extant country, the demographic die for the next several decades is already cast. It's like planting trees, right? It's like the best time to do it was 10 years ago. Right. The next best time is today. Mm-hmm. Like you can't make more people who hadn't been born, right? You can't make more 5, 10, 20, 30-year-olds.
Exactly.
Now. You can only, yeah. So the already for sure birth rate decline is upending the growth-dependent model of rich welfare states, where the redistributive support of the old in the form of healthcare or pensions is dependent on the greater number of younger workers. Like the idea was capitalism, growth would be forever. Mm-hmm. So, but now if the old are going to vastly outnumber the young, which is inevitable in countries where birth rate declines already, it's already occurred. And the only way out of that is borrowing people from other countries, immigration, right? Mm-hmm. Such systems will just no longer work. And I'm sure it doesn't take much imagination to think of some rather unpleasant scenarios as fewer and fewer younger people are asked to, are asked and also their incomes are taxed.
Yeah.
Tasked and taxed with taking care of an ever increasing number of elderly people. So there is a lot of evidence that suggests that wealth lowers fertility, that once you get to sort of a minimum standard of income, women reduce their fertility. Yeah. Which on some level seems sadly befuddling, if not tragic. We've made life so much better for ourselves that we don't want to make more lives.
Yeah.
But as odd as that is, I selected this next quote because it suggests something even more odd, that our last source of optimism would yet be more technological progress. Mm-hmm. So here's Goodhart. The end of the Second World War and optimism about the future has usually been the main explanation for the 1940s, 1950s baby boom, which briefly defied the 200-year trend that rising incomes mean fewer babies. A recent paper has, however, challenged this idea, arguing that not only did the baby boom start before the end of the war across a broad range of countries, but it was driven not so much by either optimism or returning soldiers, but rather by practical things such as medical improvements that made giving birth safer, domestic technologies from electrification to refrigeration that made everyday life easier for mothers, and plentiful housing. Something similar could therefore in principle happen again, even without a return to high levels of economic growth and a new optimistic outlook. Perhaps a drug that makes childbirth completely painless or safely regularizes babies' sleep patterns.
It's like he had me until that last sentence. So Goodhart's book is full of reliable data and I'd say accurate diagnoses of the various problems our society faces when it comes to care. But this particular sentence of his on like a miracle drug that makes childbirth painless or that makes babies sleep perfectly through the night as like, what, maybe that will solve the birth dearth. I don't know how that line got past an editor, especially if he had a female editor. It strikes me as ludicrous. Like I think this starry-eyed hopefulness in technology, I think it must come as a hangover from the pill. It's like, how can we come up with a pill that will make a healthy woman's functioning body not act like a woman's body? The wholesale removal of fertility with a simple pill, right? It's a silver bullet idea, right? It's akin to the idea of removing all pain in childbirth, which people can already do in part with epidurals.
Surrogacy.
With surrogacy. True. But it's like everybody knows, anyone who's given birth knows that like an epidural ruins your ability to push. Like you don't feel the urge to bear down because you've cut off the pain. So the women pushing without the pain often can't push hard enough, right? Or they don't, so they end up needing to be cut down there, or they need forceps, or they need a C-section, or sometimes with an epidural, women push too hard and they tear because they can't like feel out that delicate line of pushing hard but not too hard. And so the pain is actually the signal that you have to work with. It's not something to be cut off, right? And so I think there's this fundamental misunderstanding.
Technology that gives you like refrigeration, great. Technology that like desensitizes you or monetizes your attention, like, yeah, still technology, but like, like the technology that it says arm's length, the radio, the telephone, the refrigerator, there was a kind of magic to that. Yes. But it was like in this zone that was like safely at arm's distance, so to speak. And then, but when the technology gets closer, we're so tempted to think it's just like the next refrigerator.
That's right. Next best thing since sliced bread, right? It's like not all technologies are equal, just because it's a new technology and just because it's new and just because we had some amazing things in the past, antibiotics and, sanitized water, clean water, we think, we're prone to think all new technological things will be great just like that. It's like, oh.
Right. And you can't get into this Luddite sensibility because, in fact, probably the most amazing innovation of the last 200 years is clean drinking water.
Right. All the people who are alive, especially little children who are alive because of that. It's like amazing. Right. Yeah. So you can't be a Luddite, but you also can't be just a total tech positive, embrace it all.
You can't think that a refrigerator and epidural have the same.
Yeah, no.
You know what I mean?
And so, so this idea of like the pain being a signal, like it's the same thing with baby sleep patterns. They need to wake up at night because they need to nurse all the time when they're little. Like if they sleep through the night too early, then they aren't fed enough. Like, and I know this from experience.
That's
and then
not good.
Then they get underweight and then your milk supply will dry up because the baby isn't triggering the milk letdown reflex often enough. Like your boobs and your baby are in this like dynamic feedback loop. The more they suckle, the more milk you produce. And if they don't suckle often enough at the right times, you will lose your milk. And then in a different time before formula, then the baby would die. Like you just can't like insert a let's have the baby sleep through the night early like thing into this dynamic organic feedback mechanism. Like it's a dumb idea. Like evolution and God, or however you want to put it, has fine-tuned this to be just the way it needs to be, and so we're calling things problems that aren't really problems. They're like that amount of pain or discomfort of being woken at night or of like pushing out a baby is exactly what it needs to be for this thing to work. And so I think the same thing is true, like when it comes to the pill, like just like a pill, that stops women from ovulating so that their hormones don't cycle naturally and don't generate sexual desire. Like that's a bad idea for relationships. I mean, there are other ways of contracepting that don't involve nuking a woman's libido generating hormones and changing her personality, right? Like you don't need the pill to prevent pregnancy, just like you don't need a flamethrower to light a candle, like we need a minimum effective dose for solving problems rather than overdoing it. Yeah, so I think this sort of tech optimism that Goodhart sticks into that last sentence there is just a misfire. Like he had a lot of good things to say, but that idea, no. So sorry for the rant about that, but the point is that technology typically breaks something at the same time it's fixing something else. And maybe the cure is worse than the original problem. Maybe the problem isn't really a problem after all. But back to the question of the section that you started with. Is it bad if the world runs out of people? Yes, it's bad. I think the world is worse off if the people of South Korea disappear by their own hand. I don't think all of humanity is at risk of extinction from a lack of births, but certain cultures might die out. Like
humans aren't going anywhere.
Right. But the Italians or the Japanese or the Germans, they may be gone, right? Or they may get so totally subsumed by immigrants from other cultures in an attempt to compensate, right? Which some folks say is beginning to happen in the UK, part of their upheaval of what's going on in the UK. People are worried about this. It's the idea that the culture might one day functionally disappear, even if that ethnic group's genes are still floating in the gene pool. But like the sense of the people and what they were like might go by the wayside. And I'm all for diversity, so for the loss of people groups who can't replace themselves biologically, that's really sad. Even if that reduces the burden of climate change on the planet, I still think it's sad. So, certain cultures and ethnic groups are at risk of becoming like the dodo bird or the mountain gorilla. Like they're endangered groups because they apparently can't mate in the captivity of capitalism.
Yeah, that's really
they can't mate in captivity.
I like that phrase.
Right? So animal species go extinct because of habitat loss. right? And our human habitat is not just ecological. It's familial, it's relational, it's emotional, it's social. And so care is just as much a part of our required living conditions as food and shelter. So an inability to provide adequate care for one another is a form of human habitat loss. And that is not something to be happy about.
That's very well said. Yeah, I think most things, like so many things, it boils down to social contagion.
Yeah.
Once the technology, of course, is there to support it.
Yeah.
Once it's easy for any given person to have sex without having children, the popularity of that practice will spread by social contagion.
Yeah.
Humans are just great. They're mostly great at going with the flow. They're doing what other people are doing.
Right.
I remember an interview with the journalist and lesbian Katie Herzog in which she talked about her wife as a woman who probably would have married a man as a matter of course had she not been socially exposed to the possibility of lesbianism. Yeah. She'd grown up in a small town and then moved to a bigger liberal city, I think Portland, where she basically discovered something she didn't know was the thing. Right? And of course, good liberals aren't supposed to talk like that, but Katie's right, and she gets to say it because she is a lesbian, right? She did marry a woman. It's true. Most things that we do because we are influenced by our social environment, regardless of the value judgments that we also pass on them. I think Goodhart even says this somewhere. Having children at some level is habit, a tradition. And like all human habits and traditions, we can be socially swayed to lean out or lean in. Yeah. And right now there's a huge amount of social contagion around the idea that having children is inconvenient, costly, boring, and even selfish because global warming. Which is why I had to laugh at the end of that quote, right? The solution at scale to this problem is simply not going to be painless childbirth or pharmacologically induced sleep training. No. Not to mention that for the few women who want the child but think it's inconvenient, as I said, those two problems have already been solved. Surrogacy and a night nurse. Right. It drives me crazy in this book how practical Goodhart thinks he is being in his analyses. Because the problem is, I think, one of an overemphasis on the practical. Yes. You can't solve the problem of the dominance of the practical mindset with increased practicality. That's right. I mean, people are like, oh, it's not practical to have children. It's like, exactly.
Well, and this is the benefit of reading Illich, is that in some ways he's intentionally not practical. He's going back to sort of first principles. He's like, let's rethink the frame. Why are we making the assumptions we're making? Like he starts way back at the beginning, and people would always accuse him, back when he was writing, oh, you're not being practical enough. But practicality comes after you've started thinking correctly and seeing and diagnosing the problem correctly. And that's what he was really good at. And so I applaud, Goodhart's noticing of the problem, but I do think he jumps to the practicality too quickly.
It's one of those things where, you see the size of the problem and you think, oh, we need a solution at that scale. And it's like, actually, it's scale that got us here. Right. So we need to descale.
That's right.
So, but of course, we have to talk about the role of the state. Will policy be enough? And I mean, he goes over in the book how there's a lot of evidence that incentive policies really don't work. Like economic incentives. Although... I mean, I was just listening to, I think it was Konstantin Kissin. He was talking to someone who was getting interviewed on some show. And they were talking about in Hungary, like instead of banning abortion, what they did was they created all these incentives to have more children. Like if a woman has 3 children, she never pays income tax the rest of her life.
That's right.
I mean, that's if conservatives can start finding ways to get the outcomes they want without passing policies that I think are not great. Like if everybody can get something they want, like abortion remains legal, but women are incentivized to have kids, like that's a win-win.
Yeah.
That's a win-win.
And that to me seems a little bit more what Vance has been talking about. He seems to be like, we're not necessarily trying to take away lots of rights, but how can we make it easier for women to choose life?
Exactly.
The way he puts it. I'm like, sounds good.
Okay. But, so that's gone over in the book, but one of the main ideas in the book that we need to highlight is this difference between care egalitarians and care balancers. So Goodhart explains quite convincingly, I think, that it's pretty stupid for the government to subsidize paid nursery care and daycare when, for the same money, they could just subsidize the incomes of families who would, take care of their own young children. Right. Because there is a lot of surveys show that, women with young children mostly would prefer to be home. Yeah. They would work less if they could.
That's right.
Or not at all if they, some want to work part-time, some would like to work not at all.
Yes.
So, of course, the reason it seems like a good idea to instead subsidize paid care is because GDP looks at how many people are working and then generating taxes based on that from those wages, right? So a working father and a mother staying home is one job in the economy compared to 3 you'd get under the paid childcare scheme, right? The father's still working, the mother goes back to work, and the paid childcare is taking care of the child. So having government subsidized childcare probably seems like a dream to many Americans. So this whole idea that, I'm sure a lot of people would just kill to have this kind of legislation in our country that they're already talking about. They're basically doing this in the UK. And admittedly, if one income is not enough to feed and clothe your family, you've got 2 choices, right? You got to lean on family, or the state has to have a role. Mm-hmm. Part of me agrees with the notion that daycare and public school, let's be frank, that's what it does. It takes care of kids. Our infrastructure. If you have an economy that is dependent on female labor, and we do, I think like a greater percentage of the workforce, active workforce, that currently is women. Oh. Like we're like 52% of the workforce. Oh. I think. That you have to accept that the reality of that. You have to have an option. You can't just be like, in this economy, no one has children. Although I guess we're effectively kind of creating that.
Yeah.
But of course, I think it would be entirely possible for women's labor participation to be flexible around the years where any children they have are young. It's not like you can never work again when you have one kid. But you see how this brings us into thornier territory. Whose responsibility is it to support a single mother, for example, to stay home with her child? There's no societal benefit to a mother raising children in poverty. Right. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that it's any improvement on so-called patriarchy to subsidize single motherhood. Even when you rename the morality of family commitment to parent privilege. Did we do that book on the podcast? Or
we
just
haven't
talked
yet.
about doing
we
it?
just reference it every time.
Okay. I read it, though. It doesn't make a guy who thinks, well, she didn't get the abortion, she'll figure it out. I'm going to do me. It doesn't make that guy any less of a deadbeat. We totally don't care. And the mainstream doesn't enforce that stigma.
Right.
But it doesn't actually make the outcome. It doesn't change the outcome.
Right.
Nor, as much as it pains me to say it, do I think it's particularly feminist to demand support because you don't want a husband. You just want a baby. I don't think that's equality, unless it's an equality of selfishness.
Yeah. I call me old-fashioned. I just think husbands and babies go together. I think it's a package deal. It's how it's meant to be.
It's interesting because I'm sure stigma sucks. Do you know that Diana Ross song "Love Child"?
I don't know if I do.
Okay, well, it's she's singing from the perspective of that she was like a love child. She was born out of wedlock and raised by her poor mother, and it's such a stigma. And it's really interesting. It's I think it was written. I think she did it 1970. I want to say.
Oh wow.
So, the idea that was, you could even sing about that, it was current enough that people understood what that is, that's not current in our culture anymore. Mm-mm. And, I'm sure, feeling stigmatized is never fun. I think that so many progressives believe that if you just remove the stigma, you remove the consequences of the situation. And it doesn't work like that.
No.
You kind of have to... In a way, you have to do both, or you have to find that narrow space where, you're incentivizing, you're providing charity, but also incentives.
Correct.
You're never lying about it. You're never, you're not throwing you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater per se, but you're also not it's not a problem that tolerance solved.
Right.
It just didn't solve it.
Right. And again, there's an enormous difference between stigmatizing a person and stigmatizing a behavior. Right. In this case, it'd be like, oh,
I don't think liberals think that. Though.
Well, but again, it's the old Christian, love the sin or hate the sin. It's you can stigmatize premarital sex, or you can stigmatize a child born out of the bearing of a child out of wedlock without stigmatizing the child or stigmatizing the mother. I think, at least from a Christian perspective, we're always willing to separate, identity or person and behavior. And all behavior is forgivable. Lots of behavior is wrong. Everything's forgivable. All people are lovable. I just don't see this, well, you said I did something wrong, therefore you hate me? No. It just doesn't work like that. I don't understand. I just don't understand sort of the liberal fixation on the melding together of behavior and identity such that no one is ever rebukable or no one ever, I don't know. I think people are smart enough to use stigma narrowly enough to frown. I mean, it's the stink eye. Every mother knows you exercise the stink eye at your kids, which is stigmatizing the bad thing they're doing in church, and you shoot them that look. But you love your kid. And you shoot them the stink eye because you love your kid. I mean, this is how humans are meant to work. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just, this seems so basic to me. So I just get really frustrated.
It's basic. But I mean, unfortunately, like, I mean, you look at a country like Ireland, which has gone from like uber Catholic to uber woke within like barely the scope of a generation.
I know.
It's a real interesting case study. We're going to have to take this podcast on the road and go there. I'm not kidding. Okay. It's totally on our like podcast bucket list.
That sounds awesome.
I've also never been there, so I want to go. Because it's all those famous stories, right? Of like how like that's the archetype. When you go there, like I know the liberals like, oh, the Magdalene laundry. See, you diehard religious people are no good. You throw people away, you mistreat them,
and of course
too. That's true too.
That is true too.
Right.
Totally.
But it's like obviously like we need to be like cognizant of the extremes, right?
Yeah.
There's zealotry on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that probably wasn't wise either. But like the Magdalene laundries doesn't mean that like encouraging like single motherhood has no consequences. Like
right.
The two extremes don't make a moderate.
Right.
Right. That's the challenge of today's world.
Yep.
I think is that it's messy and it has to be like really messy, but also nicely moderate.
Yeah. Once again, it's a threshold idea. How do you find the threshold of just how much stigma can a society apply to a certain behavior that has bad outcomes for people, but without actually harming the people that you're trying to protect through the stigma?
Right. And I think the trick to that is you can't let it be identitarian. And then because once something becomes identitarian, it's like, yeah.
It's all over.
And that has happened, I think. That has happened with single motherhood and those types of things. I think that became very identitarian. Anyway, that's a discussion for another day.
Yeah.
But, so, equality, right? This idea of like what's fair in this context, right? So I belong to the Unspeakeasy, which I'm sort of surprised I've never given a shout out about it on this podcast. Anyway, it's an online community of heterodox women, which heterodox, I've decided, is a fancy word for women. It's a fancy word for women. It's a fancy word for just people who don't mind differences of opinion, who can like handle it, who can handle nuance, right? But so it's for women only. If you're a female, feel free to apply. And one of the women on there sent me this cartoon, which we'll put in the show notes. It's called, I'll read it to you. It's Schrodinger's Feminist. A woman is simultaneously a victim and empowered until something happens. Then she chooses which state benefits her the most.
Oof.
And some parts of this book, this whole discussion of the motherhood penalty, which is it? Do you want to be treated like a man or do you want to be treated like a woman? Because it's like, right? So here's this kind of pissed me off, frankly. So this is Goodhart. The daughter of an acquaintance of mine got a top job at a well-known entertainment company on a salary of £160,000 a year, which is a fortune. You have to remember that salaries are so much lower in the UK. That's like, think of that like double in our dollars easily. That's a fortune in England. I mean, people make so much less money there. And no sooner had she been offered the job than she discovered that she was pregnant. She offered not to take up the post, but the company, perhaps aware of their legal obligations, insisted that she still join them. She worked for the company for a few months, then took a year's maternity leave on full pay.
Woo!
Then she returned for a year and then became pregnant again and repeated the process.
Cha-ching!
Do I sound angry? I mean, that's good work if you can get it. But how is this equality? It's not equal for a business to pay mothers for not working while it pays men, and I might add other women, for working.
Right.
Nor is it particularly equal for a few fortunate women who work for such employers to get such generous support while the overwhelming majority do not receive it. It is precisely this kind of bait and switch feminism, right?
Yeah.
That's Schrodinger's feminism, where the career-minded women who fought to be treated as men to get the elite jobs now want to be treated as mothers when they get pregnant. And craziest of all, it is totally legal to pay a woman who has just given birth for not working. But it is illegal to pay a spouse or partner of either sex more because he or she is supporting a mother who is caretaking.
That's not right.
You can't do it. It's against the law here in this country. I understand that it is, right and just to pay men and women the same for the same work. But that argument, long advanced by feminism, was predicated on what, when it comes down to it, is a false premise. That men and women are interchangeable economic units. But pregnancy and motherhood give the lie to that.
Yep.
And so I think we might have to confront that. It's not just misogyny, but reality that drives the logic of the now outlawed family wage. So I appreciate that Goodhart highlights the career is fulfillment bias of the frontline feminists, because that's where this really comes from, right?
Yep.
The squeaky wheel gets the grease, which means it leaves out the voices of women who are busy living their best lives focused on, at least in the early years, mothering. He says, policy should support both work-focused and family-focused mothers. Family-focused women are less visible in public life, and their preference for more state support to stay at home when children are young is eclipsed in the debate about family policy by the arguments about improved childcare, flexible working, and the interests of those who want to minimize the impacts of motherhood on career progression.
Yeah. Yeah, you raised really interesting points here. Like, I agree with you. It's very strange to subsidize single motherhood and pay for maternity leave, but not support a family wage. That strikes me as wrong. I don't know. I think the transformation of productive subsistence households into wage-earning individuals who just go back home each night to a consumerist, non-productive household, like that transformation to focusing on the individual has obscured the continued existence of the household as a larger organism, which has, individual organs, a mother, a father, and the children. By treating family members as individuals, the economy damages the health of the whole, and then it even makes them compete with each other in weird and self-destructive ways. We'll link in the show notes to this recent article by Olga Kazan in The Atlantic, which I sent you, which demonstrates this conflict that is introduced into the household from the outside. Right? It's about Olga's experience of trying to fit an equality framework of two working parents onto life with a baby. And it's called Doomed to be a Trad Wife. Can a marriage ever be truly equal? And as I was reading about her marital and parental woes, I just kept thinking, golly gee, I am so glad I wasn't working full time when my children were small. And I was thinking, like, why would anyone choose to do that on purpose if they didn't have to? Like, it sounded to me like a self-inflicted wound on herself and on her marriage and on her child. Again, granted, women want different things, and that's fine, but care was scarce in that house, and everybody felt the pinch, and that generated resentment. And I can't remember the name of it, but whatever that deck of cards. Fair play. This deck of cards to help enlighten couples divvy up household chores.
I read that article to my husband, and seriously, ever since then, I'm walking around like, do I need to take that card? It's become like a joke. It's become like a joke. And he's like, no, the only cards in the deck, we have to agree on all the cards that exist. And I'm like, you can just make a card if it needs to happen.
That's right.
Card.
Create your own card.
It's like, I want to approve all these cards. It's like, so this has become like a joke now in my house because,
yeah.
I mean, I feel bad for feeling like so unsympathetic to these women. Yeah. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, maybe, they say a conservative is just a liberal mugged by reality. I mean, maybe what's happening in certain circles is just this generation of women who probably grew up in milieus not unlike mine, where they really were brought up to think the magic of feminism was just sort of had sprinkled this magical fairy dust where, men and women were kind of interchangeable in this way. That just isn't true. And then they didn't know that until they had a kid. They literally didn't know it.
Wow. Yeah. And so, I mean, there's nothing like a baby to make you feel the difference of how you're a woman
Right.
and he's
if
a man.
you're growing up in daycare or after school care and your parents works and your mother makes more than your father, which is true in my case, and you don't have any siblings or you don't have a lot of siblings, and, you know, like, you just, I in some senses, I mean, I feel like maybe they are just figuring it out. Like, it really is this just in. Like, they really don't know what they don't know. And so, like, you have to give better instructions.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that, because that would make, if someone just literally did not know that this was the case, that would be really shocking and difficult to find out that late. Like, after you've already married the person you've married.
After you've already invested all this time in your career. After
career.
Every single message tells you that this is what you deserve. This is how you live. Like, giving up your career makes you... Like, you're giving up what really matters to you. You're giving up what, like, makes you you. I mean, it's the messaging. I think it's the messaging. Like, I don't have any sympathy for the reality of it in the sense that, like, men are men, women are women, children are children. Mm-hmm. Not only do I think children need, like, really bona fide attention, undivided attention. Yeah. But they probably, when they're young, need it more from women just because of who women are, generally speaking. I think the reality remains the reality, but the reason these women are experiencing this as a shock is because it legitimately is. Right. Because of what they've been told and the way they've been raised. Yeah. Like, just saying it doesn't make it so. You know, I think I've said this before, but I had this little... I want to find it. I don't know if my mother saved it, but it's this little tote bag that has this, like, smiley girl on it, and it says, anything a boy can do, a girl can do better. Which I like totally get why that feminism had to be there. But I'm like, I'm raising sons. What would my son think if he sees something like that? Yeah, you know? I mean, like, I know. I make him feel like crap. It's just mean. It's both mean and incorrect. It was a weird moment. I don't know. It's a lame sentiment. It was a weird moment. I know what it's trying to say. Like, it's a compensatory thing for, like, I mean, this is what happens. You have this insane amount of social change in a very small period, and people get confused. Because it really was, like, my mother was basically told, my mother was like a straight A student. And it was like, you know, she had to be in her 30s before she developed, like, the courage just to, like, go to law school. Because she was still growing up in an age where, you know, you could be the nurse, the secretary, the teacher, the social worker. End of list. Yeah. So it's weird. That's why, like, those are the steps, right? Mm-hmm. And the final step, I think, is like disillusionment. You know, you can't have it all at once. Yeah. Yeah. And so that makes me interested in, like, examining the reason, like, for the pinch when it comes to care and how those reasons differ amongst women. Right, like the single mother who needs subsidized care for her children is probably in that position because a man has defaulted on his responsibilities, right? And the state is standing in the gap to make up for the man's moral failure and perhaps also for the woman's bad judgment, right? For her failure to select a worthy mate. But a married woman who wants to stay home with her children and do the caring herself rather than paying someone else to do it, and, you know, she's relying on her husband's support. But the law, as far as I know, isn't permitted to notice or care about that familial dependency, right? Like, he can't get paid more because he has more responsibilities, because that'd be considered discriminatory. So a married woman who has a working husband, but who wants to keep progressing in her career during the newborn and preschool stages of her children's development, she also wants the cost of care to be manageable, right? She wants to earn more than she has to pay out in childcare, which means that she must believe that she's doing something more valuable than what the nanny or the daycare worker is doing, because she wants to get paid more than them. Well, right? Valuable by economic terms, like, I mean, that's not hard to do, right? Considering how, you know, low paying childcare tends to be. Mm-hmm. And so all of these women feel that care or monetary subsidies for care are scarce, but they're not seeking support for the same reasons. You know, and I think that there's an allergy in our culture to acknowledging, like, the moral differences in these situations. Like, we just talk in general about making childcare affordable. Yeah, we don't talk. Remember, no stigma,
no
judgment.
no stigma, right? But that bland generalization ignores the reality of the larger whole, the organism of the biologically created family, in favor of the individual who needs help paying for childcare services, right? And I just don't believe that a mother mothering her own child is doing exactly the same thing as a paid care worker substitute. But the word childcare is it's what Illich would call a key word.
Totally.
Right? Like, I don't think he mentions that in his book, but I'm pretty sure childcare is a key word.
Oh, I think that rings the same bell.
Yeah. So just like the words transportation or education or health, childcare, like those words, these are words that impute a need, which the market can then supply and which can then become scarce. So a generic neutered word like childcare erases the naturally occurring relationship of mother and child and introduces an outside monetizable source of care in place of an autonomous, organic, natural source. And I think that's a head trip. I think it's alienating. I think it's part of what degrades our human habitat of social relations by making us think that we lack a capacity which we actually possess. We are carers just like we're human. We shouldn't need to purchase care. Like, we should do the caring that our natural biological relationships make obvious and obligatory, and that our proximity to others makes obligatory. I think the state should heavily favor what Goodhart calls care balancers, since that's more likely to include people who want to fulfill their caring responsibilities themselves whenever possible, rather than outsource them. So I think the state should support caring families and not just competitive consumerist individuals. But it doesn't see the family. It sees individuals who need the service of childcare. And I think it's a form of violence. I think it's wrong to intentionally blind ourselves to the family as this larger body, which has subcomponent organs, right? There's actually a violence to our sense of reality that occurs by viewing everybody as individuals competitive with one another. It makes me mad.
All right, so let's rail on the feminists more. The elephant in the nursery, feminism. I like that Goodhart quotes Camille Paglia's book, Free Women, Free Men, which maybe we should read that this year.
Yeah, I love Camille Paglia. We haven't read her yet for the pod,
okay,
so we should do that.
So at the beginning of chapter 8, he quotes her, feminist ideology has never dealt honestly with the role of the mother in human life. I think that's probably the root of most of it, right? Mm-hmm. Feminism is based on the idea that the selflessness of motherhood is a creation of the patriarchy, that it is imposed, that if women were somehow left to choose, they would not want to be mothers. Goodhart sums this attitude at the beginning of the book. He says, women are having fewer children later in life. For most of history, society has, in a sense, free-ridden on women. They have borne most of the physical and emotional cost of delivering and raising babies. Today, thanks to reliable contraception and sex equality, having children is a choice in rich countries. Women are increasingly reluctant to pay the price now that they have other options. Okay. So this idea of free riding expresses the goal of feminism as liberating women to not have children, which also implied back in the day the choice not to marry, but rather to support themselves by working. So as I was sort of alluding to earlier, this is the philosophy I lived and breathed as a child, that my intellectual ambitions were totally unequivocally valid. And that was great.
Yeah.
But now that I'm in my late 40s, I know this isn't the whole picture. While there is, I think, a lot less of the kind of sexism that kept women out of high status careers and like, women are still women and men are still men. We still show up to work as who we are. People respond to us at work as who we are. And all those dynamics between the sexes still apply. Indeed, those dynamics have totally changed the workplace itself in a lot of cases because women are so ubiquitous and even dominant in many industries and fields. So the ethos that I absorbed, that sex was blissfully irrelevant, seems at best naive and at worst a lie. I now think it's incredibly sad to frame having children as paying a price, as Goodhart puts it. And sadder still to see so many young women just ruling out procreating. Yeah. My husband has 2 sons and 2 nephews because his brother has 2 sons. And their collective attitude, this next generation, seems to be one of, it's harmful to the planet to procreate. Or, this world is too messed up to bring children into. Well, I do not think you can lay that fatalism directly at feminism's door. the kind of progressivism that generated that fatalism often claims feminism as one of its success stories.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking. I mean, a generation of genuinely well-meaning people, basically the tribe I thought was mine until a short while ago, has unwittingly disinherited themselves of their own legacy, their own grandchildren.
That's so sad.
I mean, isn't that like tear?
Yeah.
Tear
really
face
sad.
emoji?
Yeah, it is. And I completely agree with you about, the problems of this phrase, society has free ridden on women because we're the ones who have the babies and care for them. As if men, simply because they can't conceive, are automatically free riding on women. But couldn't you just as easily say, society is free ridden on men? They're always the only ones who go off to war and die in combat, often in their teens and 20s, by the tens of thousands or more. Women free ride on the blood of brave young men.
And they did.
And they did. Right. I mean, but it sounds absurd. It's like, yeah, you can say that. But I mean, just like good hard sentence. But the concept of free riding, what free riding really means, it's about lazy and sneaky people taking advantage of the duty and trustworthiness of others who are acting in good faith. Right? Like free riding is a form of selfishness. But the fact that women have certain gifts that men don't, like childbearing, and men have certain gifts that women don't, like size and upper body strength.
And the courage that testosterone gives you.
Yes, exactly. And that these gifts aren't interchangeable because their bodies aren't interchangeable. That doesn't mean that men and women are free riding off of each other.
Yeah, that phrase is definitely this sort of sneaky egalitarian type. Yes.
Yeah. Wrong
as if
word
like
to
they
use.
weren't having the babies because they were lazy. That's why they weren't having the babies. Those
right.
Men. That's why.
Yeah. No. And those lazy women, those cowardly women, they just didn't want to
weren't
go
going
into
to
battle.
war. They were just exactly.
It's like people aren't stupid. I don't know. It did. Yeah.
But people really believe this. I mean,
and
you know the extremes it's gotten to. I mean, yeah.
But what that really means, that men and women's bodies aren't interchangeable. They do different things well, and they just do different things. It means they're complementary, right? It means that they're designed, by evolution, by God, by both, to serve each other and to serve the greater whole. The differences are the differences of organs in a body. The lungs and the heart are different. They do different things for the sake of the body of which they constitute an important part. The heart isn't free riding off the lungs.
Oh my God.
It's a stupid idea to think
that. That's a
that.
very beautiful way to put it, yes.
And again, it's this blindness to the larger body of what humanity is and of how societies organize themselves. You have to see it as a larger, bigger than one person body. Like you have to be willing to see your little individual self as just an organ, as a little piece.
Right. And capitalism makes its money by absolutely vitiating all of that.
Destroying it.
Yeah.
Yep. And I also dislike his use of the language of paying the price of having children, as if children were either a product,
which they can be,
or an expensive luxury good,
which they can be,
yes, or a punishment, which I don't think they are, but you can take it that way if you want, rather than what they are, which is people. They are not products; they are people. And it makes me sad too that the next generation of your husband's family is apparently deciding to be the last branch of the family tree. And again, here's the idea, family tree. Like
right.
the tree, like, there's something before me and there are branches after me and I'm part of this flowing, ongoing, bigger organism. The metaphors we use matter, right?
Right.
They want to be the last branch on the family tree because that sort of cynical antinatalist attitude is not natural, right? Like they've caught it from the liberal meme verse, from the urban monoculture. Desire for children and desire against children are both social contagions. Like most desires, they're mimetic. And now that contraception is cheap, reliable, and universal, we have to cultivate our desire to have kids. We have to actively opt in. Like if you're listening to this and you're realizing, I don't want children, but I want to want children, then you should get yourself to an evangelical or Catholic church because that's where the babies and the kids are. That's where the happy families are. Lots of them. And you can see it in action. You can help in the nursery. You can befriend tired parents. You can offer free babysitting and help provide care, right? And you will come to like kids. But you have to expose yourself. Yes, well-raised kids, right? Children are an acquired taste. Enjoying them is a virtuous habit and a skill that you can grow in. I think
you read that article about children, parents not encouraging their children to share. Did you read that article?
No.
I don't think I sent that to you.
That sounds terrible.
It is terrible. Yeah.
Okay. But I wanted to turn back for a minute to that opening quote where Goodhart says, now women have other options besides providing care. And to call this options sounds good. Everybody loves options, right? But what if we call it opting out of relationships and relational duties? Like, that doesn't sound so good anymore. Because options, he's framing it as options of, the good things to do instead. Well, it's like, instead of what? Mm-hmm. Oh, what are you opting to not do? Oh, relationships, relational duties. Oh. So there's this article in First Things by Christopher Lasch that I really liked. It's called Conservatism Against Itself. And then he talks about the power of the free labor market to reduce our complex and many-layered social ties to the tiniest individual bits. And then we call that social obliteration progress or women's liberation.
Do we now?
So here's what he writes. The reduction of labor to a commodity, the essence of capitalism, required the elimination of all the social bonds that prevented the free circulation of labor. The destruction of the medieval guilds, the replacement of local government by a centralized bureaucracy, the weakening of family ties, and the emancipation of women amounted to successive steps in the cheapening of the raw material of labor, all achieved under the watchword of progress. In the 20th century, conservatism has incongruously allied itself with the free market, including the free market in labor. What passes for conservatism, in other words, has allied itself with the very forces that have brought about the progressive shattering to atoms of our social system. So the care dilemma, which Goodhart says is a result of women's newly granted sex equality, is the story of free market ideology convincing us that not just men, but also women should have the privilege of being forced to sell their labor as a commodity in competition with every other wage slave out there. So that the realm of uncommodified life shrinks in half. And children and the elderly become this bizarre anomaly of a clump of useless people who can't sell their labor, but who instead need our help.
Or you just make it illegal for them to sell it because, we outlaw child labor. Doesn't
true.
mean they wouldn't be wanted.
True.
It just means you're not allowed to use them.
Yep. Yeah. And then we enforce the idea of retirement. It's that's when you stop working. And so we begin to look at care through a market lens, and it ceases to be our normal autonomous human activity and becomes an external expensive service. Right. And then we start asking the government to take care of it for us because we can no longer afford what our ancestors used to do and have for free. And the burgeoning service industries of education and daycare for the young and medical interventions that extend life and elder care for the old are extremely expensive industries, bankruptcy-inducing expensive. I was just listening to a podcast on that the other day, a woman who went bankrupt trying to care for her elderly parents into their 90s. You know?
Man.
And so just think of the college debt, the medical debt, the elder care debt that people incur. So there's something about these industries that I think is parasitic. They further disable us as communities and families by making us think that things like care, in terms of basic health and safety, and education, particularly in the earliest years, they make us think that these require paid professionals because regular people without a special degree shouldn't try this at home. Right? And because I've spent so many years homeschooling, I've seen its effectiveness. I have smart, competent, creative children. I have skepticism towards the professionalization and the servicification of care, for quote unquote non-productive members of society. I feel like we're all being taken to the cleaners. We are being played, but I feel like we can't talk about it honestly because it's so bound up with more opportunities and choice for individual women.
That's probably true. And then remember that part in the book where he says the amount of money that originally that the UK spent on its pension and its healthcare system was 5% or
and then it just
exploded. And the reason it exploded was because, in the beginning, people just used to not live very long.
Right.
The average amount of years somebody would spend in the pension system was under 10 years practically. People just had more dangerous jobs. Yeah. We couldn't save a lot of, we weren't doing triple bypasses as a matter of routine.
Right.
You couldn't save people from the diseases of,
of old age.
From old age or just even just hard living.
Yeah.
You couldn't. So it's a lot of this is the idea that you can go bankrupt taking care of your elderly parents. It's that's only possible in a world where, again, back to, what you're saying about Illich, where we don't have we've totally lost the concept of what the limit is.
Right.
Because, you know, like, and that whole part in his, because we both read that biography, and how he had that tumor in his cheek, and he was like,
Illich did.
He had this whole thing about he was just like not going to go there.
No, he just smoked opium, right?
That's one way to do it.
He smoked to help reduce the sense of the discomfort, to help him cope, because he valued coping, like suffering is this action that you do yourself. You bear your own suffering and you do that. And I suppose, he eventually died, and that was probably the thing that killed him. But
I don't know, though. I don't know if
maybe not.
Maybe not. But this idea that he was very conscious of the idea that, like, if you cheat yourself out of your kind of cross to bear, like, you may miss your. It's almost like he had this sense, like, it's like you're gonna miss your train.
That's
like,
right.
You have
this
one way
exit.
into the world and one way out of the world, and you gotta like be aware and make sure that you don't miss your train. And that's like, talk about things we can't speak honestly about.
Yeah.
We can't talk about, modern healthcare is nothing short of miraculous in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah.
But, we can't afford to give everyone miraculous healthcare to keep them alive indefinitely. Right. Like, we can't do that.
Yeah.
And we have no way of reconciling ourselves to that. We have no way to talk about it, to get a handle on it. We don't have the vocabulary. We don't have a framework of what enough is.
Right. And this is part of why I love reading Illich, is he talks about this idea of you preside over your own death. You are the one who actively dies. Right? And yet we've outsourced death to the hospital. And now we think everybody dies in a hospital, and death is pronounced when you can no longer be a consumer of their medical services. That's when you die. We can't give any more products and services to you, therefore you're dead. And I think of my, my
even
husband,
then though, organ donation.
That's another thing. Like my husband often speaks highly of this. We look up to his grandmother, who, when she was in her, I guess, early to mid 80s, she got a diagnosis of lung cancer. And she just said, well, I guess that's what it's going to be. And she went home. And she died relatively painlessly. It did not really hurt very much. And she died of lung cancer rather than getting super sick on chemo and surgery and radiation, and like doing all the things that could have been thrown at her. And I worked in cancer research, and we had a lot of old people who were still trying everything for another year, for another 6 months.
It's a mindset.
Right. And made themselves extremely sick and frail and uncomfortable on the side effects of the treatments to extend their life. Right. And so my husband definitely has it in his head, I want to die like grandma. But she
except you don't want to die like grandma at 58.
That's right.
That's
right.
the rub,
that's
though.
Right.
That's the rub.
Right. But how do you know? How do you feel that out when you're like, all right, here's my exit. It's very clear. How do you prepare yourself? This is always my question. It always comes back down to how do you die? Like, how am I going to die? How am I going to be ready to die well?
On that cheery note.
Yes. Last section.
The meek will inherit the earth. I never, ever, ever understood what that meant. I thought that was the most random, totally, of all stuff in the Bible that I, phrases that I knew that I was I would ponder.
Yeah.
That one never made sense until now.
Huh.
Now it makes perfect sense. It absolutely does. Because if, you just have to be well, I'm just going to do this. And that is a kind of meekness. It is a kind of sort of humility in the face of overwhelming messaging and fear-mongering.
You mean I'm just going to do this, I'm going to surrender to becoming a mother, to having children. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, the people who are paranoid about the planet aren't procreating. And the people who are whatever, are getting on with it.
Yeah.
And there's an irony there. And the conversation about the speech I'll link to in the show notes about population decline talks about this, about how, one of the dangers of lowered, of fertility crashes is the fact that so much innovation is driven by the young people.
Yes.
So if you don't have a young society, you don't have an innovating society. And it's interesting to see, when we think of, I guess now it's there's tech bros on both sides of our sort of facile political divide. But this idea that, there is a certain irony, I find, that progressives are anti-natalist because progressivism, optimism, innovation is a thing of the young. If you don't believe in youth, how progressive can you possibly be?
That's interesting. What I mean? The progressives aren't making more youth.
See, I don't know. It strikes me as an irony. Okay, to reiterate, it seems we have gone from one extreme of childbearing to the other. So here's 2 quotes from Goodhart. Nobody wants to go back to the days of large families with mothers trapped in domestic drudgery into their 50s. Nevertheless, a norm of one-child families is a dismaying prospect with unpredictable consequences for the national psyche. And he adds a few pages later, my 2 graduate daughters are in their early 30s and pursuing demanding full-time careers, as are their 2 younger brothers. All are unmarried and without children.
I keep wondering, wonder what his adult kids think about him writing this book. Did he have to get their permission?
Be my guess. So I think this is a really good book about the problems.
Yep.
I mean, I think it's a good survey book of the issue. But I mean, Goodhart, bless his heart, does not have an Illichian understanding of the world at all. He's too pragmatic. He's accepted the reign of scarcity.
Yep.
He believes that the state can at least be part of the solution. And you can't really fault him for thinking that, because in reality, the state does manipulate the economy to an extreme degree. I mean, there's money. There's a large amount of money on the table there, especially in the UK, with their much more advanced welfare state in some ways. But his faith in the state is not just about finances. It's about knowledge. And that's where it really was like, I roll. Here's the quote. One simple way that the state can help is by providing a single online family hub with authoritative information about all manner of things, from nutrition, breastfeeding, including expressing and storing, sleep deprivation, and dealing with the physical and sometimes mental scars of childbirth, to reliable directions about child development and advice on how to protect the mother-father relationship. There is a huge amount of free advice already to be found online. But young mothers do not know who to trust, and the imprimatur of the state would be a reassurance. So this is where he completely loses me.
Yeah.
I just don't think the imprimatur of the state is going to help society find its way back to some sort of happy procreating point between the drudgery of the past and the apparent death spiral of the present.
Yeah.
I think this has to be a grassroots effort.
Yep.
Like Mary Harrington proposes in her New Year's post, where she encourages the return of the aunties. Women who believe in the magic and merit of marriage and raising the next generation have to meddle.
Yes.
We have to show and tell. We have to tell young people that marriage is good. And in fact, my husband and I can take at least partial credit for one marriage already.
Oh,
Thank you
for
very much. And then we have to show up for all the people in our lives who have children. I'd love to see geographic distances between families shrink, but I'm also a serious believer in allo parenting. I think that's an oldie but goodie we could bring back. I think there is a role for everyone who's willing, and I think we definitely need all hands on deck, especially if your relatives aren't going to have kids. I mean, I have no kids, so I can't have grandkids. But if you're not going to have any biological grandkids, get some non-biological allo grandkids or whatever we're going to call them.
Yeah.
It really does take a village, and nothing is stopping us from being village people.
Yeah.
Charity starts at home. Do what you can to fill the need you see around you with your own eyes and stop thinking about the big picture. This is why I really think people just need to stop watching the news.
Yeah.
Full stop. We are so conditioned now to see everything as a societal level problem, which always translates into a scarcity of a service.
Yep.
I'll find this and link to it in the show notes. There was a segment on the PBS NewsHour last week. I actually meant to send it to you before now, but I didn't. About a place for mothers to go postpartum to get relief, sleep, company, advice. And naturally, it included the lament that it wasn't covered by health insurance. This is the scarcity mindset.
Yeah.
That we cannot provide for one another, that we need the imprimatur of the state or a business or whatever to do things like keep mothers safe and sane with their newborns. Enough.
Yeah.
We just need to put down our phones and do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, this is always what Illich prompts us to do, to practice the grace of austerity, which means, like you said, put your phone down and attend Like, notice who is around you, notice who needs help and care, and show up for them. You know, and George, I know you are a very loving and willing babysitter for some of our mutual friends. And I think that's beautiful. And I, like you, I believe in allo-parenting too. My mom's dear friend, Jean, was my regular babysitter every Wednesday night for my entire childhood. She was my second mama. She changed my diapers. She let me style her hair. She let me clop around the house in her high heels. You know, she gave the biggest wet kisses. Like, we would sing together. We played the flute together. You know, she became my dear, dear friend as I grew up. She went to all my concerts. She was at my graduations. I was a flower girl in her wedding when I was 12, and she was a bridesmaid in mine. And she didn't have kids of her own. She wasn't able to, and that was a really deep grief for her. And she was hospitalized in her 50s from heart complications related to diabetes. And the hospital staff kind of screwed up a routine procedure which disconnected her from oxygen for multiple minutes, and she ended up becoming brain dead.
Oh my God.
Which is awful.
That is awful.
And so her family and her husband ended up making the tough decision to pull the plug eventually because she was gone. I mean, you know, talk about iatrogenesis. This is part of why
it's the trade-offs.
Medical nemesis, you know, why this resonates with me. Yeah.
No, because I mean, like, if it's one of those things that, like, if it had gone right, she could have gotten all these extra years.
Right.
But when it goes wrong, there's no recompense. There
isn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
Well, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Yeah. So my second mother died at the hands of incompetent nurses. But prior to her fading away, she did manage to scribble my name on a piece of paper next to the words, "my daughter."
That's so wonderful.
Yeah. And so I still have that piece of paper, you know, and so I know who she was to me, you know, and I know who I was to her. You know, and she helped to raise me. She also loved me into my personhood like my parents did. Like, she was part of the village for me. You know, and she was with us because she loved our family and we loved her. And she was just always around. She was always around for every important thing, and also for just random little things. She was just always over. We saw her at church every week, and she was always at the house. And I know that we were good for her as much as she was good for us. You know, it was just what it needed to be, you know. And like, her pain of not being able to have children, I never asked. I don't know if she did any attempts at medical interventions. I don't know. And things would have been different if she'd had her own children.
Exactly.
It would have been very different, right? Like, and so there is a way in which only the particular form of her bearing the suffering that she had and taking that suffering and turning it into this grace for my whole family and her presence with us and who she, and what the kind of love and attention and presence she was able to give to me. You know, I know, and it would be right if it wasn't there if she had her own children, because she'd be busy taking care of them, right?
Right, but in the state of a real absence, to create another genuine thing that can only emerge from that absence.
Yes.
It's the antithesis of the environment that now dominates, you know, the way we think about it, is that everyone deserves the same thing. Like, it's this, like, the right to have a child. Right. Like the discourse about, like, you need to get yours because otherwise it's not fair.
Right.
It's like, that's the exact opposite of the mindset of what you're describing.
Right. And I feel it now differently as an adult who now has my own children. And I have just much more empathy for the loss that she must have gone through, and for her ability to overcome whatever perhaps envy she may have had of my mother for getting to have children and their friendship, whatever envy or difficulty or sadness or resentment that could have been there, whatever she did on the inside, none of that came out towards any of us, you know? And so I wasn't in her mind. I don't know, but I do know how much she loved me and how much she was there for me. And when she got older, and how I was able to be there for her, and like the kind of relationship we were able to have. And in some sense, that kind of thing was only possible because of a certain type of suffering that no one would wish on anybody.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
it's simultaneously no one would wish it on someone, but also in that era, in that moment, no technology could take it away either.
Right.
So it had to be born.
Right.
And the things that come out of the things that have to be born.
Yeah.
That's where the grace is.
That's right.
And that is the world that, like, capitalism and envy don't want that world to exist. They want to march in there and insert themselves and say, you know, no, like everybody gets a kid.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, you know? Yeah. And it's like, in the name of, you know, why should someone have to suffer? It's like, you know, I mean, it's right. Don't all the questions go back to that? Aren't all the questions like your question is like, you know, how to die? I mean, it's how to suffer. Subset of the question, you know, like, what is the meaning of suffering? And I think that we're living in the cul-de-sac of, you know, the progressive answer to that. And it's not a very pretty place. It's not the place that I think the people who thought by like removing stigmas and removing, you know, it's not the place that was promised, because it turns out that that suffering actually makes us what we are.
Yeah. And that we have the capacity within ourselves to become like deeply loving people.
Yes.
Like she was able to love in a way that precisely because of her suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just sort of floors me.
It's a real thing.
And yeah.
Yeah, and that is the thing that, like, when you're trying to, like, divvy up chore cards and you're just generating resentment about who's doing what, like, you can't get there from there.
That's right.
You can't get there from there.
Yeah.
That's the disconnect.
Yeah. So I second your call here, you know, that nothing is stopping us from being village people. I love that. Like, we are the source of care for one another. The state can't do this.
And honest to God, why would you want them to? Like, how old do you have to be before you have some sort of awful bureaucratic experience with this kind of stuff? And you're just like, no. This is not.
It's not worth it.
It just can't. This just can't. Oh, man.
And as much as I was bemoaning at the beginning of the podcast the fact that I live far away from my parents, the fact is that my parents have always been village people. They have a loving church community and plenty of friends. They know all their neighbors. They give care to people around them all the time. Like, there was this old guy, Bob, in their church who was a widower. And when his wife died, he was just completely lost. He didn't know how to do anything. You know, he's one of those dear guys who just totally incompetent without his wife. Like, he can't cook, can't do, you know, and my mom, and my mom would, you know, my parents would have Bob over to their house like every week for dinner and to play dominoes, you know, and like my dad would have to like walk behind Bob on the stairs up to our house to make sure he wouldn't like fall over backwards. I mean, he needed a lot of care. Like, my parents, even though they're like in their late 70s, they're like the kind of people who are like, who can we look out for? And
because they're in the habit of it.
They're in the habit of it. And they've got you know, there's like a single mom and her teenage daughter who like in the church who like have no money, and like they're always having car troubles, and they're super in debt, and like men have failed them in multiple ways, right? They've got nothing. And so my parents are always like, they're giving them money for groceries, or they're like finding some occasion, or they'll lend them their car. They're like, they're always doing things, right? Like, that's what they're like, you know? And I know that when my parents need help, they have a lot of people around them who can help them, right? And who already have been helping them in different ways. Mm-hmm. So thank God for that. And my family in our town here, we're trying to create that, you know, to give and receive local care like that. And for us and for all of my far-flung extended family, like all my aunts and uncles and cousins, pretty much almost all of them are Christians. The local church is like the primary fountain of charity, care, and connection for all of them too. Like, even though we don't live near each other,
I don't doubt it.
We've all found our little platoon of other Christians who will take care of each other.
I mean, I think that's sort of part of the point.
Yeah.
I think that's where a lot of the political biases come from about who should provide that care. I mean, I think that's kind of obvious. I mean, it was always felt obvious to me.
Yeah. Right. Conservatives are like, of course we can do this ourselves.
I don't need the state to do this. Exactly. Yeah. No. And,
right.
and I mean, if you think about it, it's very pragmatic, because like, why would you want to pay higher taxes for the government to hire people to do it when you're already doing it and you're already giving money to your church?
Right.
Like, there is a real... And I think there are also like equally progressive arguments to be made that care should not be delivered by the state. We'll have to link to that crazy article I found yesterday about parental shaming.
Yeah,
which
that was very interesting.
Women taking away other women's babies. Like, we think that we don't do that in the modern world, but we do it through social services.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely head-exploding emoji article.
Yeah. So that's crazy.
I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so this idea of the meek will inherit the earth. The meek are the ones making friends and getting married and having babies.
They really are.
With this hope in the future, right? They refuse to be cynical. And those are the people who will pull through whatever hard times are ahead. And I'm sure there are. There will be.
There always have been. I mean, like, hello, World War II, anyone?
Yeah. I mean, the people who form bonds of care, who see care as a capacity within themselves and a virtue that God calls them to, rather than seeing care primarily as a service to be paid for in the market or provided by the government. That's who the meek is, right? They can do the care themselves. I know multiple people now who started going to church solely for this reason, like the social care aspect, for care and connections. I think that's wise.
That's why most people have gone to church forever?
I don't know. I don't know. Because I mean, the way that I grew up, it was all about like, well, this is what you believe, and you gather with other believers, and then the social part was sort of like this after effect. At least that's what people stated.
Okay.
But I mean, I know people who don't believe in God who are going to church for the care, for the mutual care, and that makes sense to me. Like, when the floodwaters are rising, you got to seek higher ground, right? Like, you've got to find a human habitat that's still growing its own care in the wild, right? And that's the wild. The wild is church. That's what I think.
Yeah.
That's where care is growing naturally.
Yeah, no, I think I've just been listening to a lot about atheism, and like I read Orthodoxy, which you kindly gifted me for Christmas, which we definitely need to do that book on the pod. And we could do like a whole series. Like, that book's crazy. Like, you could just do like you could have like just an Orthodoxy Twitter account and like put a tweet each day for like a year.
It would be amazing.
And just like digest that book.
Yeah.
I think I feel like if there is going to be a kind of religious upswing, it's going to occur in these places that challenge these kind of presumed barriers, like that church is about believing, and like in the sense that, or believing the way we think of it, like, because I think like the whole idea of a secular age is that we now think church is about not being an atheist.
Right.
But atheism is about not believing in church, but I don't think the reverse is true.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because a lot of people have been talking about the idea that like new atheism is dead, and like sort of like the projects that it was, like, both as a movement of kind of, both as a social movement and as kind of a politically adjacent movement. I was never into any of that. Like, I don't, like, it never really like struck me. I never felt the need to be like debating creationists online, or like I was just not a very online person. But even those arguments like just seem sort of like secondary to things that like were really important. But also, there's a fundamental difference between, like, you can say that atheism is a belief structure, but it doesn't have a liturgy.
Right.
Unless the liturgy is like, just complete political, like, solipsistic agreement about like issues. And I think that's what it's descended into. It became like this very narrow-minded, politically correct, like there was this whole brouhaha about the freedom from religion society or something. Like, they like wandered into the gender wars, something like that. This is like, it's like, it seems very predictable. It's like, yeah, of course it's going to get ya. It's going to get ya. And, it's a liturgy that prevents any of that from, like, that's the immunization. If you can give people something to talk about, that's not their, if you can, if people aren't going there to like, if you're, the purpose of being there is going through something, saying things that are agreed on, rather than sort of like constantly refining down your sort of shibboleths, then you can like use that as the glue, and then everything around that, all the care, all the relationships, all the support, like, then that doesn't have a limit. But you can't do that. Like, you're never going to get to the soup bringing and the muffin making, and you're never going to get to that part if you're gathering around like, we believe in nothing, or,
right.
You're never going to get there.
Right. Yeah, you have to have a liturgy around a beautiful story that resonates with people. And I think the Christian story is true. But it's certainly beautiful. And I think most people agree with that, whether they think it's true or not. I think most people agree it's at least beautiful.
Well, and I think even if you're uncertain about the truth, I think for me, a lot of it is like, it's familiar.
Yeah.
Like you've been in it, even when you weren't in it. And I think on some level, maybe the last, for people of my generation of a certain age, it's almost like the sun has come around on the mountain to a certain angle where you begin to see, in the light of all the things that, progressivism has trying to sort of like, fire hose into the public sphere in the last 5 years, you begin to sort of see the old in the light of that. It like becomes, there's a certain like reflection that's been created because of just the sort of like recent changes. Like you become conscious of what the background was in a different way. So you begin to see the sort of context that you kind of just took for granted in a whole new light.
And you're like, wait a minute, that context was Judeo-Christianity.
Exactly.
I guess I'm kind of already more than half there.
Exactly. No, and I think that, and it's just this, what is the status of belief too? Like when you have a liturgy, when everybody's there and you're mouthing the words, you're not mouthing the words, or most people are mouthing or saying the words, like, it's just like that it's just like that thing about stigma. You think, remove the stigma, remove the problem. Like most people look from the outside inside as a church and say, and see this phenomenon where they're like, oh, I don't believe that, so they don't want me. And it's like, that's not how liturgy works. It's happening and you're there, and it's not an inquisition. It doesn't work by that process, because it's really not about you as an individual. It's about you as like this idea you're talking about, the body, like
right.
The body of Christ, the church, right?
Yeah.
And we're not used to thinking of ourselves that way. We get so taken away from that entire collection of corporatist, right? I mean, even the idea of like the corporation, we don't think about that and its origin, where that word comes from.
Right, corpus.
The corpus, the body, right? We don't think about that anymore in that way. And it's, we're very, we're so sensitive to ourselves as individuals that we can't even like surrender it, even when it would be like handy.
Right. And I find it to be such a relief to be like, okay, the body of Christ is going to be singing the liturgy this Sunday at a church near me, and I can go and sidle up to that. I can enter into that. And it's, the spotlight is not on me, right? Like you said before, like no one's like scanning your forehead when you come in. Like, do you have all the proper thoughts to be in this room with these people at this time? It's not how it is. And like I've said before, that love makes things plausible. Like you can come in and be a part of it, and in a not in a passive way, but like you don't have to be saying anything. I mean, my family was at the Catholic Church for many, many weeks before we sort of started to finally memorize what the words are. And you can read them from the book, but it's the best when you finally have them memorized and you know exactly what's coming next. And like, I've got the folk dance of it now. I have the flow of it, and it is so wonderful. And I love being a part of it. But it is very, on the one hand, it's intimidating if you don't know what's happening and you're like, am I going to do it wrong? Am I going to be standing at the wrong time, or am I going to say the wrong thing? But if you don't think of it that way, if you think of it like a body that includes you, and you can be present, and you'll slowly catch on. Just like when you listen to a song over and over, you slowly start to know the words, and then you start to sing along a little bit. Just think of it like that. Like go to church to like learn the song.
So we haven't made any decisions about next time, although we could just jump and say we'll do the Camille Paglia.
Let's do it.
Let's do
something by Camille.
Let's do some
She's
actual
spicy.
feminist red femmes again.
That's right.
Okay.
Back to our roots. All right. Well, Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy 2025.
Thanks for joining us, and hopefully
Hope you read all the books on the list.
That's
that
right.
Acton made generously for you.
Read all those books, and may care not be scarce for you this year.
Amen.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Acton. Hi, George.
It's right!